Hi, I'm James Brookes, and welcome to From the Factory Floor, a conversational podcast about all things startup and tech, brought to you by the folks at startupfactory.tech. So somehow we've made it to our third episode of the podcast already. I know it's only been 3 weeks. So last week we spoke all about ideation with Ian. This week he returns for his third episode in a row. So Ian, are you there?
Yes, by popular demand.
Yeah, popular is a strong word. But then also joining us today, we have the Head of Engineering at the Startup Factory, Eric.
Hello, everybody.
His debut appearance, but I'm sure Eric will be making quite a few appearances in the future. So before we go into the topic of today's podcast, which is going to be all about minimum viable products or MVPs and all the rigmarole that goes around them. Eric, I don't know if you want to do a sort of very quick introduction about what your role is at the Startup Factory and why you're here, basically, outside of us asking you very nicely.
Yeah, that's fine, and it will be very quick. So yeah, I am Eric Carter. I'm the Head of Engineering at the Startup Factory, and to put it simplistically, my job is to make sure we build the right thing, that we build it well, and that we actually deliver it.
It's actually a really good way we should actually have that as our tagline.
I like that, Eric. That sounds really good.
You almost think we practiced this.
Absolutely.
For any listeners out there who think we have, we really haven't. Today's episode, we kind of hinted at it at the end of last week, is all about the MVP. Now, for my 2 pence worth to kick us off, I think I've always had an issue with the MVP or minimum viable product because of two words in it really that really throw me off, and I think that everyone always has a different opinion. And those words are what is classed as minimum and what's classed as viable. Now, I don't know if either of you two have a particular opinion on this and want to jump in, but I've always found that sort of what people assume to be minimum always seems to get inflated when we talk about MVPs and POCs and risk assumption tests and that sort of thing.
Yes, there is obviously like a challenge between what is minimum and what is enough. And most people who have an idea of something want it to be absolutely amazing and don't actually put much effort into making it minimal. I think it's us from the engineering background who know how hard it is to create even simple things that know that we need to focus.
Yeah, if you kind of go back to where this MVP craze started from, that's Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup. I mean, it was full of stories about startups that wanted to do something, started with an MVP and kind of used it to accelerate their path to the product. So for me, the definition is kind of threefold, really. It's your first version of the product that has only the features necessary to test the market. So it's not necessarily an application prototype, it's about a market test thing. I think to Eric's point then, it's a product with must-have features. And it's kind of the product that's kind of the proof of concept thing. So yeah, I think
I take a bit of issue with that.
Mm.
So you've kind of said it's to test the waters, and you've said proof of concept, but I very much think of MVP as the distinct next phase beyond proof of concept and testing the waters. So I think we're right. It has this kind of the 3 prongs for the 3 words. So minimal, it only has enough features in it. It doesn't need all the bells and whistles and everything for every possible user.
Yeah.
Just enough features for the early adopter users.
I found a really good quote, which was from Steve Blank, which is, when you talk about an MVP, you're selling the vision and delivering the minimum feature to sell to visionaries, not mass market. And almost that POC stage, that proof of concept beforehand, is to sort of see if those visionaries would be interested in the minimum viable product, would then almost sell into them. I don't know if that's kind of where you're heading with that, Eric.
Yeah, it is. But and then so that's the minimum part of it. But the bit that really distinguishes what I was thinking from kind of what Ian was saying was the product word. So the product word is, there's probably a few things in the background behind it, like, it needs to be quite robust and professional and things like this. But the key point is that I think it's the point at which you can start selling it. It's no longer just a test or a free trial. Will someone use it? Will they not? But it is that point that someone will start buying it. And then the other word in there was viable, which we haven't really talked about. But I think to me, what that means is that it doesn't have to be perfect. Pretty much no software in the world is perfect. Everything's got bugs in it. It doesn't have to be optimized. It just needs to work mostly. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think this initial part of the discussion kind of highlights where some of the confusion is and kind of my clumsiness there to Eric's kind of more articulate view. So for me, when I say proof of concept, it is the minimum product that customers will buy that has that minimal feature set. And it's also kind of a technical demonstration as to what the thing is. And the third piece, which I know Reese was very keen on and something we apply to our thinking, is it's kind of a learning process as well about the kind of your behavior of your customers, how they're going to use it, the problem they're solving. Are they using it as anger as you anticipated? And a point you made, Eric, I think is also important, that today's software tools are much more powerful and more accessible than they were. So it's not prohibitively expensive to build something that's got reasonable quality and not tied behind an MVP as something shabby and that's got bugs.
I think it's almost, so when we look at an MVP scope, and there was something that I remember one of my mentors when I first started doing project management said was, what's the minimum feature set you need to be able to make £1? So it's almost like, what's the minimum you can build for 50 quid or getting out the building? It's, if someone was to pick this up, would they pay for it? And also, can they physically pay for it? So it doesn't necessarily mean that your back office systems, which aren't particularly customer facing, maybe you don't have a fancy dashboard, you have to export it in a CSV and, do something in Excel. So it's almost what features, or one way I've looked at it is, what features can you take out because there is a workaround, which then takes the onus off the development team, and like you say, the ability to then develop it more cheaply, or at least focus your resources onto something which is going to be very customer facing, is going to be very part of the USP of this product.
Yeah, I wouldn't kind of overly focus on cheap. I know what you mean. It's kind of budget. I think there are three things. It's kind of looking at your potential risks, how much time you think you have, and what budget you've got, how much can you afford. What's the most effective thing you can build in the time and the money that you have to get your idea out to market. I mean, remember, you're not trying to make your customers happy at this stage. Your main goal is to learn about them, and therefore that kind of low fidelity MVP, I think, works.
So it kind of leads into something which I've always thought about an MVP, and something which the design sprint really looks at. And also we'll talk about design sprints and startup sprints in future episodes. But there's really, what I've always seen is three real aspects of what an MVP and how people view it in the different viewpoints, which is the functionality. I think we've covered that quite a lot already, and obviously alluded to what feature set do you need to provide the minimum viable experience. I think you mentioned it there, Ian, is the design aspect. And, how polished does it have to look? Are your early visionaries, your early adopters going to be, is it going to service them in terms of how the UX and the UI works? And then really, obviously, far more from your perspective as sort of, Eric, in terms of engineering, is the technical MVP and the tech, what tech has to go into it, what build is it? Can we build it, use one technology which gets us so far, which will be quicker, maybe not cheap is the word, maybe efficient is probably the right word there, Ian.
Yeah.
And then something that always seems to get missed is minimum viable business. And, does that actually fit within a business model?
I think we've covered quite a few things in that past few moments. So I think and a lot of people think of MVP purely as that list of feature set that they require. And that's only one dimension of it, like we've kind of mentioned with design, etc. So yes, we can have the feature, but we could do it maybe low fidelity or high fidelity. Depending on what the product is and who it's selling to, that might be a reasonable choice to make. So I mentioned it briefly in the book that if you're doing a customer facing thing actually the screens and the graphics might need to be more polished. But if you're doing, say, a data science tool or something like that, then it's far more the functionality part, and the workflow doesn't necessarily need to be as swish. And then, the tech side. So you kind of mentioned it already, James, in some respects, that there are some things that you can cut out because you can do them manually in the back office. You might just export to a CSV or do something rather than running an automated payroll or whatever it is. But I think we always try and build something that can grow. So when you're building a proof of concept, you're really just tackling does it do the thing I need it to do? Does it work? I think when you're building the MVP, the product, yes, you're not going to over-engineer it for your million users you're expecting in 3 years' time. You're going to target it the 100 you've got for now, but you still need to use some technology that will allow you to get to 1 million users without having to completely start again. We might only have one database, but we'll have it in a way that when we need to, we can scale up to, shards and regionality and all of that lovely stuff.
Yeah, some good points there, Eric. I think, I always kind of go back to the iPhone and kind of when that iPhone 1 came out, it was kind of the unknown pleasures of owning an iPhone. And I think you think back to what the battery and the camera functionality was of that iPhone.
Did it even have a camera, the first one?
Well, that's what I'm saying. It didn't. And then how they've developed the pixels and the quality and the use of the phone, and kind of back to the learning aspect for me, what's the growth strategy for your product? And the MVP kind of gives you that. It certainly gives you the engineering feel for it. And the closer you get to the customers and the adoption and learning from them, and that kind of gives you more feeling of control over building what your startup product's going to be, and not kind of just that thing you've invented in your bedroom in the garage and you want to get out there. You put some engineering features and functionality in, and you're starting to learn what's more valuable, what people will pay for, and what kind of solution is more, most effective for the customer.
That's a really good point, that most effective for the customer. So I think a lot of founders, when they come along, they kind of think of their broad vision, that when it's up and running and they've got millions of people using it and it's filled with thousands and thousands of bits of data, it will have to work in a certain way. And that's kind of what they pitch at. I think a lot of people miss the fact that, things start slowly. So, for instance, if you're providing a system that, allows people to manage content, so videos or music or something, so maybe you're building a Spotify or something like that, when they think about it, they think, I've got this library of 1 million things, so it's hard to navigate through that library. I need all this functionality to help people find the right track by the right subject, length, whatever it is that they're going to use to filter it. But actually in their first couple of months, they're only going to have maybe 20 or 100 tracks on the system to start with. So in that scenario, forcing the user through this long search process makes it harder to use, when actually a flat list will work in that scenario. So when you're targeting your first early adopters and your first kind of user base, you might want to build something that's slightly different to what you anticipate in the long run. That's something I think a lot of people miss.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, your MVP, the feedback could be, was this slow? Yes. Was it expensive? Yes. Is this scalable? No. But to your point, Eric, it's actually providing you data that there's a market for this kind of service, and how you then improve it. And it kind of gives the product team the information they need to kind of take things, move them forward.
It's almost like, I think someone mentioned there's almost the expectations. I think we look at a lot of MVPs these days and people just assume a fully functioning product, whereas, like I said, if we are just looking for those early adopters, I almost think to, the level of Kickstarter or Indiegogo or all those platforms where people post, their ideas, their dreams, what they want to build, and whether that be technology, whether that be board games, they then release them, see what the sort of demand is. They can see that through the amount of people that obviously pledge cash effectively, and then they can then build, and then based on feedback, they can release that first product, and then that MVP is then what they iterate on and use. I think we said it last week about the ideation, that those cycles of build, measure, learn, not just at the ideation phase, but taking that from that base level product of the MVP, taking that forward.
Yeah, Eric, what are your thoughts on this? We get a number of very capable, smart thinking founders walking in through the door at Manchester Tech Centre with an idea. How do you, from a technology point of view, onboard them with the concept of an MVP when they don't have a tech background?
That's definitely the hard one, isn't it? So changing someone's philosophy or way of thinking, or just educating them into how something goes. A lot of people want to, want their fixed price, fixed scope kind of, I know what I'm going to get for my 50 grand or whatever it is that they're putting in. But yeah, it's just a really hard way to work like that. It's, the agile approach of uncovering things and iterating on what you find out, certainly how I think. It's hard to communicate that. I think we've started kind of talking about, agile process and lean in a more than MVP at the moment. But I think that's important because I think thinking of MVP as a concrete specific thing is wrong. That actually those MVP decisions and that MVP way of thinking should be applied every time there's a decision point throughout the life of the company. It's, let's focus now on what gets us, what's most important now, and then build on it later, rather than trying to define it all up front.
I mean, do you think it's almost worth setting an expectation at the start of a project? I know obviously we've discussed it internally within the startup factory, as to, especially when founders are so passionate about their ideas and often, have done their sketches, like you said, Ian, in their bedrooms or in their sheds, come up with this idea and think, it's going to be the next unicorn. But then obviously then having that scope reduced, or, having their idea sort of just reduced slightly is obviously quite a hard thing I can imagine to go through. But having that level of understanding that you can get there, and it's about having that forward vision, but understanding the here and now, and understand that this product needs to be able to handle a certain key metric, or be able to cope with a certain whatever we want to use as a key sort of motivator and key thing. So this is being successfully used, and then having that build, measure, learn cycle in. How important do you think it is to have some sort of metric or some sort of idea around what you want your MVP to actually be able to achieve at a base level?
I'm not sure you need a metric, but I do think you need a focus. So what is our one vision or our one thing that we're trying to do now? And just for each thing that you're looking at, does this get me closer to it, or does that get me closer to it? And making those decisions, I think that's helped us. And
yeah, it has. I mean, first thing, James, I'm going to dock you a week's pay. You mentioned the word unicorn. We don't do startup buzzword bingo at TSF.
Get one in.
But back to the point now. I mean, I think, there's kind of a stampede for feature priority, isn't there? And, the emotion, the energy, the vision, and the appetite to go fast. Whereas, almost perversely, the kind of build, measure, learn feedback loop. So I think in terms of metrics, I'm with Eric. There's no point in just pulling some metrics out of the air. I think it's more about the hypotheses, the things you're looking to test. What are the three things you're looking to test where there's still a degree of uncertainty, there's some unknowns? You've got a gut instinct. You know that this thing has got potential, but what are those unknown factors? And I think the hypotheses are kind of really a good structured way of understanding what your thing is trying to achieve, but you want that customer feedback, get it in the hands of the users. So, I think as the advocacy of lean startup, getting out of the building, get it in the hands of users,
Yeah.
It's still got to be a good experience, but you've got to, that phrase I use, you've got to avoid that stampede for feature priority early days.
And I think from what you just said there as well, it's probably a mistake for us to try and define what minimum is. So we probably shouldn't say, this is the minimum viable product, this is what we're going to try and build. Should we not just throw it out there and release it as soon as possible and allow the user base to decide what minimum is? And what is wrong with releasing something too soon?
I almost think there's just an expectation to some extent. I think really, in an ideal world, you could throw something out into the wild, see how it does. You built it, you measure how people react, you gather feedback, you learn, you improve, and you just keep iterating on that. But I think it's a classic thing of if you release your MVP in quote unquote when you're comfortable with it, you probably missed the boat.
No, like what Eric said, I think without getting too philosophical about word definition here, throwing it out early and kind of a part of that customer discovery process early on, and just being comfortable that you're going to get some pretty raw feedback and not necessarily what you want, but you need to know. I guess the only risk really is kind of anything around the brand or the naming of the product, if it does get tarnished very quickly and deeply. But again, it's about managing expectations, as you kind of indicated, James. And again, one of the things around that whole customer discovery process is just, release fast, release often. I think failing often is an overstated phrase for startups, because I think that isn't good as a habit or as a kind of moniker. But I think learning fast and minimum, what is minimum? Then it's beauty in the eye of the beholder. It's kind of what will users use it for.
I think there is an element there that we haven't really mentioned, but kind of goes into it as well, which is depending on what you're actually trying to achieve, there is an expectation. If you're also building a banking application, like I say about the reputation, we've all seen how the big banks, when they get hacked and what can potentially happen to them, or I know British Airways have the same thing. That expectation, they've not thrown it out too early, but if you're building a banking application, you have to have a level of security and a level of finesse and robustness around your product which is slightly higher. And so you can't have a MVP of an air traffic control system, I know is one of Ian's favourite phrases.
Oh, well, that's go on, we're all jumping on. Go on, Eric.
Yeah, I was just going to argue with that. So I think it comes into the different parts of how I defined MVP earlier on. So the product part kind of encompasses the things that it must do, like you must keep people's data safe and so forth, and as an air traffic system you must be reliable and have certain fail-safes and what have you. But you can have an MVP of an air traffic control system, right? It's just that it only does a certain part of the job, whereas a full air traffic control system might do more parts of the job that previously you did on paper or something like that. So it's, in that respect, it's kind of about which features, not how well produced the features are. So yes, there will be requirements on engineering something well, and more in certain scenarios, like we said earlier as well, also for the user experience side. Sometimes that has to be better, sometimes less so.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of update that example, James, when Johnson announced a world-class track and trace system would be available from the 1st of June. So, never get your marketing ahead of your product development and your testing. And here we are kind of mid-September and we still haven't seen that. So I think there's lots of things to think about. The user primarily has to be at the focus of what is this thing for and what's the MVP trying to achieve for your user. And as we've suggested, managing that founder expectation. They've done all the ideation. I've got my vision. I know what I want it to do. It's kind of just small steps, really, without kind of going down some cul-de-sacs.
I want to go back to something that Eric said and about sort of you have to look at, there'll be some things which are a higher priority. Is that something where do you think people get wedded to a particular feature set and say this is what needs to be minimum? And obviously, there's then the whole conversation around, you go into budgets and costs, whereas I know we've discussed internally, Eric, that actually what's better, rather than having here's a line and I want all of the above, it's about prioritizing.
Yeah, I know where you're going. So, and there was something brilliant as well, COVID related about this. So, we've obviously all run out of testing capacity at the moment in this world-class beating track and trace system that they've decided that they do need to prioritize who gets tests. So they've said things like, obviously medical people, well, they must be tested because obviously they've got to keep thinking. Schools, well, they must be tested because blah, blah, blah. And then I heard somebody on the train on the way home yesterday saying on the phone, they were saying, oh, I didn't realize because I work in retail, I can get prioritized in the testing as well. So they seem to have prioritized everybody to the top of this list because that's how a lot of people do things. But it's probably the easiest lesson to learn or to teach is that you can't put two things at the same priority. So instead of marking everything as, well, this is a must-have feature for my MVP and so is this and so is this, just force people to put things into order. Which one do I do first? Which one do I do second? And that way, that's quite an easy exercise. And it's definitely more accurate and useful to do it that way.
I mean, I've always noticed whenever we've done previous lives, sort of Moscow priorities, must, should, could, wish, or want, or whichever word that people seem to substitute at the end. Everything seems to be must have. And I think that's always been the problem, that, everything is important because a lot of founders have put a lot of thought, a lot of effort in. But you can't, like you said, Eric, you can't build everything first.
And I think that comes back to the fact that people think of MVP as a concrete set.
Mm.
If you stop thinking like that and you think, actually, I'm just on a long continuous journey. MVP isn't now what am I going to get versus what aren't I going to get. It's what am I going to get first, what am I going to get second. And that's a much easier decision to make because you don't have to throw things away. You just have to say, well, which one do I don't want to do next?
As the company librarian, I hoard all our post-it notes from all the design sprints and things that we've done. And I did an analysis actually a couple of weeks ago as we're kind of looking to develop our own startup sprint kind of methodology. And back to your point, James, that something like 60% of those design sprints in that first day, 60% of the features were must-haves, which is ridiculous in terms of, to Eric's point about how you have that kind of list of that shopping list to do and kind of that forward view. But yes, 60% of the folks that come to us and identify these are must-have features. Incredible.
It's incredible, but I'm always surprised that it's that low. I mean, I've had it where I think I remember doing Inception way back when. I think every single feature was must-have, and we ran an exercise of what's most important. Is it the functionality? Is it sticking to the budgets? Is it the team size? And sort of having a look at how the project could flex and scale. And it was an exercise that was putting 4 pegs into four slots, and literally it took us about 4 hours.
Mm.
Just because you can only have 1 peg in the first spot, 1 in the second, and just being able to actually look at the project. And obviously this wasn't startup, so it's a very slightly different thought process. But that level of actually when you make people choose, the decision is more meaningful. But obviously it can be very difficult at times to think, well, actually everything's most important. If everything is, then nothing is, without quoting Syndrome from The Incredibles. If everyone's super, then no one is.
So I think the closing point for me is MVP, a lot of thinking, a lot of wrangling, often some tension, but it is about priorities. It's about your first users. It's about getting it in the hands of people. But you have to think about risk, time, and cost. But it's not a forever thing. It's just the first start.
Yeah, I think that's a nice kind of point to try and sort of just close us off here, because I know we're getting up to our usual time slot for this. So I'll just ask you both one last question, one last point, which is, if you were to have one takeaway that you'd want people to get from this, or one learning point, what would that be? And Eric, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so it's probably the thing that sits behind a lot of this stuff So it's not the most obvious, but it is that, don't think of MVP as a single concrete set of stuff. It's just, the way of thinking, of focusing and prioritizing constantly and doing one thing first and then moving on and building later.
Ian?
Aligned to that, I'd say, if you're not embarrassed by your MVP, you've gone too slow. Get it out early. Really, coming back to something that Eric said, don't be afraid of getting out early.
Build, measure, learn is one of the most important, then iterate is one of the most important things that we've been able to obviously go through the startup journey. Well, I think that just about wraps up. So thank you very much, Eric. I think it was a good debut. And as ever, thank you, Ian. I think you get a break next week as we take what we've discussed here about MVPs and actually start looking at a slightly more technical level at what the tech vision is for a product. And obviously it links slightly back to the MVP in terms of where, obviously having a vision but knowing where to start. And I think, Eric, and you might be back for that one. And we might also be bringing in another member of the team in Alexa. So thank you very much, chaps.
Great.
Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
I think that just about wraps things up here. If you have any thoughts or questions on anything we said today, get in touch, whether that be through our Twitter @RealTSF or email at hello@startupfactory.tech, or feel free to drop in for a coffee and a chat. As ever, thanks for listening.